In the most expensive restaurant in the city, he came alone. No reservation. No designer suit. Just confidence, and silence. They judged him. Mocked him. Sat him near the kitchen, like he didn't matter. But what they didn't know, he owns the place. And tonight, silence speaks louder than power. The streets of Dallas gleamed under the early evening lights as rows of black Escalades and polished Teslas lined up outside the Iron Oak, an elite steakhouse nestled in the heart of Highland Park. Inside, the smell of aged oakwood mingled with the scent of dry-aged ribeye, and waiters in pristine black vests floated gracefully between tables like tuxedoed phantoms. The chandeliers overhead flickered like stars frozen in time, casting a warm amber glow over diners in tailored suits and glittering evening gowns. Then, the front door opened. A towering man stepped in. Leonard Miles, nearly 7 feet tall, wearing a gray Champion hoodie, loose sweatpants, and a pair of white sneakers that had clearly seen better days. His build was unmistakable, broad-shouldered, commanding, and yet there was a gentleness in his step, like someone used to being stared at but unfazed by it. His presence, while quiet, shifted the atmosphere in the room like a sudden breeze through still air. Leonard glanced around and made his way toward the hostess stand, avoiding eye contact, hoping to go unnoticed. But in a place like the Iron Oak, where appearances were everything, blending in was out of the question. Behind the podium stood Brooke Wallace, a striking woman in her late 20s with icy blonde hair tied in a high bun and a name tag that sparkled under the soft light. Her posture was impeccable, her smile practiced, her judgment instant. She had worked at the Iron Oak for 4 years and considered herself more than just a waitress. She was the face of the restaurant's elegance, the unofficial gatekeeper of its high standards. Her eyes scanned Leonard from head to toe, the baggy clothes, the worn sneakers, the lack of a luxury watch. Her expression froze. He doesn't belong here, she thought. But she kept her composure, her lips forming a thin smile. As Leonard approached, she tilted her head ever so slightly, a small gesture of doubt cloaked in politeness. "Good evening," he said, his deep voice carrying warmth and clarity. "Is there a table available for one?" Brooke hesitated, caught off guard by his politeness. But her hesitation quickly shifted to a smug smirk. She leaned slightly forward, lowering her voice but not enough to be discreet. "This is a fine dining establishment," she said with a subtle raise of her brow. "Are you sure this is where you meant to be?" Several heads turned. The question hung in the air like a bad perfume, faint at first, but offensive the longer it lingered. Leonard looked her in the eye, unfazed. "Yes. I'd like to have dinner here. If you have a table." Brooke blinked slowly, disappointed by the lack of embarrassment she expected to see. Still, she nodded with forced grace. "Let me see what's available," she replied, her voice syrupy but sharp. She turned away quickly, but not before muttering under her breath, "He's not going to last 10 minutes. From her tone to her expression, everything about her screamed condescension. To her, Leonard wasn't a guest. He was a mistake to be corrected, a disruption in the pristine tableau that was the Iron Oak's dining room. Leonard waited patiently, standing tall amid the soft murmurs and clinks of cutlery. He looked around wood-paneled walls, curated art, tables decorated with silver cutlery and folded napkins like origami. He didn't look uncomfortable. He looked observant. After a moment, Brooke returned. "Right this way," she said, grabbing a menu. But instead of guiding him to any of the beautifully lit tables near the fireplace or under the grand chandelier, she led him to the farthest corner of the restaurant near the swinging door to the kitchen. The overhead light flickered slightly, the scent of grilled meat wafted faintly from behind. She gestured to a cramped table by the wall. "This should suit your preferences." She dropped the menu onto the table with an audible thump and offered a thin-lipped smile. The implication wasn't subtle. She was doing him a favor by even allowing him to sit down. Leonard looked at the table, then at her, then sat without a word. He thanked her with a nod. She hesitated, then added with a smirk, "Hope you're ready." Our cheapest steak starts at $95. Leonard smiled faintly. Looking forward to it. She turned and walked away, heels clicking sharply, as if making a statement with every step. This man doesn't belong here. And I made sure he knows it. What Brooke didn't know, what no one in the restaurant knew, was that Leonard Miles was no ordinary customer. And this quiet dinner would soon become a defining moment, not just for her, but for every person watching. Leonard sat in the dimly lit corner of the iron oak, his large frame barely fitting into the small leather chair Brooke had smugly assigned him. The soft sounds of laughter and clinking glasses filled the air, but over here, near the kitchen, the ambience was tainted by the distant clang of pots and the occasional call-out from chefs. Though the seating arrangement was clearly meant to embarrass him, Leonard remained unfazed. He sat tall, his hands calmly folded on the table, eyes scanning the intricately designed menu like a man exploring an unfamiliar but welcome destination. He had played in louder arenas, stood taller in harsher storms. A corner table and a cold smile weren't going to shake him. Across the room, Brooke watched him with narrowed eyes. The fact that he hadn't shown even a flicker of discomfort irritated her more than she wanted to admit. She had expected confusion, maybe even a bit of hesitation. But Leonard looked like he belonged here, like he owned the room from that poorly lit corner. Determined to poke at his pride, she grabbed a leather-bound menu and marched back to his table with the elegance of a runway model and the sharpness of someone ready to strike. "Would you like some help choosing?" she asked, her voice sugary but biting. "Our prices can be surprising." She tapped the corner of the menu with a manicured nail. "This one here," she said, pointing deliberately, "is our dry-aged tomahawk ribeye, $145. That's before tax or tip." Her words hovered, daring him to react. Nearby diners who had already begun to pay attention subtly turned their heads again, pretending not to listen while hanging on to every syllable. Leonard looked up slowly. His deep brown eyes met hers without flinching. "That sounds excellent," he replied with a polite nod. "I'll take it. Medium rare." Brooke blinked. That was not the response she expected. She tried to recover, forcing a thin smile. "It's quite large. Most people find it a bit overwhelming." Leonard's smile widened slightly. "I played 4/4 in 100-degree heat once. I think I'll manage a steak." For a split second, Brooke's mask slipped just enough for doubt to flash in her eyes. But she quickly turned on her heel, muttering under her breath, "Let's see how long this act lasts." At a nearby table, a woman in a sleek navy blue dress leaned toward her husband. "Did you hear what she said? She's practically mocking him." Her husband, a bespectacled man in his 60s, sipped his bourbon and nodded. "It's disgusting. He hasn't done anything but show grace." Meanwhile, Leonard leaned back in his chair, scanning the room slowly. He could feel the weight of whispers creeping toward him like fog judgments hiding behind champagne flutes and couture gowns. But he didn't budge. He didn't need to. He knew what this was. He had seen it before on the court, in boardrooms, even walking through airport terminals in sweatpants. He wasn't dressed for attention. He was dressed for comfort. But for some people, comfort looked like a challenge. In the corner, Jake, a busboy barely in his 20s, stood polishing glasses behind the bar. He had watched the interaction quietly, tension pulling at his brows. He knew Brooke's tone too well, he had seen her wield it like a blade on others before. But something about Leonard's calmness made him feel protective, almost proud. Jake turned to the bartender beside him. "That guy in the corner, he hasn't raised his voice once." The bartender nodded, still watching. "He doesn't need to. He's got presence. That's something money can't buy." Back in the kitchen, the line cook called out Brooke's name, signaling that another table's appetizer was ready. But she ignored it, too busy circling back toward Leonard, unable to resist one last jab. She stopped beside his table and leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to sound conspiratorial. yet loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You know," she said, "we do have a house burger if you're looking for something more accessible." Leonard smiled at her, not out of amusement, but with a kind of peaceful pity. "I'm sure it's good," he replied, "but I came here to experience the best." Brooke froze for just a second. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. No arrogance. No anger. Just quiet certainty. A tone she had heard before, from people who didn't need to prove they belonged anywhere. Flustered, she turned and stalked off. The sharp click of her heels echoed louder than before. At a corner booth, a woman named Vanessa, a real estate executive who had just finished her second glass of red, leaned toward her friend. "He's not just calm, he's teaching her something without saying much at all." Her friend nodded. "Yeah. And she's not ready to learn." Leonard picked up his water glass and took a slow sip. He wasn't there to cause a scene. He was there for dinner. But some lessons, he thought, get served whether you're hungry for them or not. And tonight, the Iron Oak was about to be served something unforgettable. Leonard sat quietly, sipping his ice water from a crystal glass, watching as waiters zipped past him, balancing silver trays topped with $200 wine bottles and sizzling steak platters. Brooke had vanished into the more brightly lit parts of the dining room, attending tables filled with laughter and luxury. But every few moments, she would pass by Leonard's table with the same cold indifference, never making eye contact, never acknowledging his presence. Her heels clicked rhythmically on the polished walnut floors like a metronome of disdain. The soft jazz flowing through the sound system provided a fragile elegance to the room. Diners smiled, flirted, and toasted over charcuterie boards. But slowly, unknowingly, their attention began shifting. The energy in the Iron Oak was changing. The more Leonard didn't react, the more powerful his silence became. And the more uncomfortable Brooke felt. She couldn't shake the feeling that her control was slipping. Every time she walked past Leonard and didn't get a reaction, it was like a mirror was being held up to her own behavior and she didn't like what she saw. At the far end of the restaurant, seated under a mounted set of longhorns and framed oil paintings, a couple in their 70s, Mr. and Mrs. Langston, watched it all unfold with quiet dismay. Mr. Langston, a retired federal judge, sipped his Cabernet thoughtfully. "He hasn't done a single thing wrong," he murmured to his wife. "And yet she's treating him like a trespasser." Mrs. Langston leaned in, her pearl earrings glinting in the low light. "There's something dignified about the way he's sitting there. Like he knows this place better than anyone in it." Back by the bar, Jake had paused his glass polishing entirely. He leaned on the counter, eyes following Brooke as she stopped at a table of tech investors, laughing a little too loudly at their jokes, offering wine suggestions like she was auditioning for something bigger than waitstaff. Jake shook his head. "She's putting on a show for them," he muttered. The bartender beside him chuckled under his breath. "She always does. But tonight, she might be performing for the wrong crowd." Back at Leonard's table, the clatter of dishes and aroma of seared meat drifted faintly through the nearby kitchen door. Still, no food arrived. No updates. No apology. Just time ticking. He glanced at his watch. 22 minutes since placing the order. He wasn't angry. But he was aware. He remembered games where fans shouted slurs from the stands, where referees made bad calls just to prove a point, where reporters questioned his intelligence because of his size and smile. He had survived all of that. This was just dinner with a side of ignorance. As he sat in that dimly lit corner, Leonard thought of his grandmother, who used to tell him as a child, "People will always try to shrink you to fit their comfort. Don't shrink. Let them adjust." So, he adjusted nothing. He sat. He waited. And slowly, the room began adjusting to him. Whispers started. A few guests leaned toward their companions, eyes darting discreetly toward the large man in the corner who hadn't flinched once. "He's still waiting? Why is no one serving him?" She hasn't gone back to his table once. At table 5, Vanessa, the real estate executive who had noticed the tension earlier, leaned closer to her friend and whispered, "She's ignoring him on purpose." Her friend frowned. "She's really playing with fire. He's handling it better than most people would." Brooke returned to the tech investors' table with a tray of cocktails and tossed her hair as she laughed at a story about private jets and startup chaos. But as she set the drinks down, she caught Leonard's eyes from across the room. He was still watching. Not glaring. Not challenging. Just watching. That look hit her harder than any complaint could. Her stomach turned for just a moment, but she brushed it off. He's just here to prove something, she told herself. People like that always want attention. But the more she tried to believe it, the more it unraveled. As she turned to head back toward the kitchen, she passed close to Leonard's table. Without looking at him, she muttered just loud enough for nearby diners to hear, "Some people really don't understand how this place works." The words weren't meant as a joke. They were a warning to herself, to him, to anyone listening. Leonard heard her. He didn't respond. He didn't even blink. But across the room, Mr. Langston lowered his wine glass and looked directly at Brooke. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. "You know," he said evenly, "sometimes silence isn't ignorance. It's grace." Brooke froze for a beat, her back turned, her breath caught in her chest. Leonard lifted his water glass once more, took a sip, and smiled calm, self-possessed, quietly powerful. The restaurant didn't know it yet. But they were no longer watching a man eating alone. They were watching a masterclass unfold. It started with a hush. Not a loud commotion, not a breaking glass or a raised voice. Just a slow, collective awareness that something was off. The Iron Oak, known for its perfectly timed service and seamless hospitality, had a rhythm. But tonight, that rhythm was stuttering and all eyes were subtly turning toward the corner table. Leonard Miles hadn't moved. He still sat with the same calm posture, still sipping water, still wearing that soft, unreadable smile. But the fact that he had been seated, unattended, for over 30 minutes, had begun to draw more than curiosity. It had started drawing quiet outrage. At table 6, a young couple who had arrived just 20 minutes earlier had already received their wine and appetizers. The woman, Jasmine, glanced toward Leonard, then back at her partner. "He's been here longer than us," she whispered. "And they haven't brought him a single thing." Her partner nodded, frowning. "And look at Brooke. She's acting like he's invisible." At another table, Mrs. Langston leaned in toward her husband. "He's becoming the center of the room without saying a word." Mr. Langston, who had been in more courtrooms than most people had stepped into banks, nodded solemnly. Because when injustice is quiet, the right kind of silence becomes louder than shouting. Brooke, meanwhile, was beginning to feel the pressure. Though she refused to admit it. She had just delivered a bottle of wine to a group of finance executives at table 2, bowing slightly and laughing as they made snide comments about stocks and cigars. But her eyes kept drifting again and again toward that corner. Leonard hadn't called her over. He hadn't raised a hand or cleared his throat. But his stillness was starting to sting. His composure wasn't just dignified, it was undeniable. Back by the bar, Jake finally stepped away from polishing glasses and leaned toward his supervisor. "Do you think we should ask the kitchen about his order?" he asked softly. "He's been waiting almost 40 minutes. The supervisor, a lanky man with a tight smile, hesitated. "Ask Brooke. It's her section." Jake nodded but didn't move. Instead, he looked over at Leonard again, watching the way he turned a glass slowly in his hand, examining the reflection of the chandeliers overhead like he had all the time in the world. It wasn't the kind of behavior that came from someone desperate to fit in. It came from someone who knew exactly who he was. The tension began to thicken like fog. Several diners were now outright staring. Some wore confusion. Others, guilt. And a growing number were beginning to show visible signs of discomfort because they knew what they were witnessing wasn't just bad service. It was targeted neglect. Brooke walked past Leonard's table again, tray in hand, pretending not to see him. But the performance was cracking. Her steps weren't as graceful. Her smile was slipping. She could feel it, the invisible weight of dozens of gazes pressing on her spine. And Leonard? Still unmoved. Still waiting. Still in full command. Back at table 8, Vanessa, the real estate executive, had enough. She set down her glass, turned slightly in her chair, and stared directly at Brooke as she passed again. "You've ignored him long enough," she said, not loudly but clearly. "He ordered before us. You haven't even offered him bread." Brooke froze mid-step. A hush rippled through the surrounding tables. Her smile flickered back to life, forced and too bright. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, "there must have been a delay." But her voice sounded thin now. Hollow. Defensive. Leonard simply looked at Vanessa and gave her a respectful nod, as if to say thank you, but also, "I've got this." He didn't need rescuing. He wasn't a victim. But every act of solidarity mattered. Vanessa turned back to her table, her voice quiet but firm. "You can't just sit by and watch this kind of thing anymore. Not in 2025. In the far corner, Mr. Langston watched everything with quiet pride. "He's not fighting them," he said to his wife. "He's teaching them. And they don't even know the lesson's begun." Mrs. Langston nodded, her eyes glistening slightly. "This is more than dinner now." As the minutes ticked on, the atmosphere in the Iron Oak transformed entirely. The jazz no longer felt warm, it felt ironic. The luxury no longer impressed, it felt fragile. And every diner, server, and manager in that space was starting to feel something they weren't used to feeling inside those walls. Accountability. And Leonard? Leonard hadn't even touched a knife or fork yet. But the table had already turned. The soft rustle of linen napkins and the faint clinking of silverware continued to fill the air, but it was no longer comforting. The Iron Oak, once a haven of quiet class, now buzzed with a silent anticipation, every table aware, every conversation thinner than before. Then came the moment Brooke had been waiting for. A tray. A single plate. A chance to reassert control. She walked toward Leonard's table with a deliberate calm, the tray held firmly in one hand, her heels tapping across the hardwood like distant warning drums. The air shifted with each step she took. Diners subtly leaned closer. Some even stopped mid-chew. The dry-aged tomahawk ribeye Leonard's $145 entree rested on a porcelain plate with a butter-brushed bone jutting out like a crown. The steak was perfect. The delivery? Anything but. Brooke reached the table, eyes narrowing just a fraction. With a flourish that bordered on mockery, she placed the plate in front of Leonard with a clink louder than necessary. "There you go," she said, her voice sweetly sour. "The tomahawk. Hope you'll be able to handle it." Leonard glanced down at the steak, then up at her. "Looks great. Thank you." His voice remained unchanged, low, calm, impossibly unbothered. But Brooke wasn't done. She leaned forward slightly, just enough to be intrusive, and added with an edge, "You know, most people who order this actually understand what they're eating." A collective stillness passed through the room. No one laughed. No one spoke. Leonard, unfazed, picked up his steak knife. "Well," he said with a slow, courteous nod, "I suppose there's a first time for everything." Brooke straightened, her composure slipping like a frayed hem. She opened her mouth, as if to fire back one final jab, but then paused. The man hadn't just disarmed her. He had elevated the moment above petty sarcasm, above class-based ego. He refused to join her on the floor she'd been trying to drag him down to. And somehow, that made her angrier than if he'd yelled. Across the room, Vanessa smirked into her wine glass. She just got served, she whispered to her friend. Mr. Langston, never one for drama, leaned slightly toward his wife. You see that? $1,000 education couldn't teach that kind of restraint. His wife nodded. He's turning this into a lesson. Not just for her, for all of us. Brooke spun on her heel, retreating from the table with more speed than grace. As she passed the kitchen door, her eyes met Jake, who stood motionless by the service counter. She's pushing too far, Jake muttered under his breath, unable to look away from Leonard's table. Back at that table, Leonard sliced his steak with slow precision. The knife slid through the meat like butter. Every bite was deliberate, not in hunger, but in message. He didn't scarf down the food. He respected it. The way one might respect a moment you know others are watching. Because they were. All of them. Each guest, each server, each glance became part of the performance Brooke didn't realize she'd started, and Leonard was now directing. And he never had to raise his voice. A young woman at a nearby table, no older than 20, whispered to her father, "Is he famous?" The father, an investment banker who had seen egos come and go, replied without turning his head. "If he's not, he should be." Back in the kitchen, Brooke slammed the tray onto the counter with a sharp clang, startling the prep cook next to her. "He's playing games," she hissed under her breath. "Pretending to be all composed. He doesn't even belong here." Jake, unable to hold it in any longer, finally spoke up. "Maybe he just wanted a peaceful dinner." Brooke whipped around. "With those shoes? In this place?" Jake frowned. "Maybe it's not the shoes that are the problem." Brooke said nothing. But her clenched jaw told the story. Out on the floor, Leonard continued his meal without rush or concern. A thin smile played on his lips, not smug, not defiant. Just assured. He didn't need validation. He didn't need approval. And in that silence, in that presence, he had already won more than a debate. He had changed the entire temperature of the room. No longer did the crystal glasses sparkle as confidently. The $400 bottles of red no longer tasted quite as bold. Because every single person now had to ask themselves one simple question. What would I have done? And for most, the answer wasn't comforting. Just as Leonard brought the final bite of steak to his mouth, a hush rippled through the dining room like wine through tall grass. From behind the bar, the manager emerged. Martin Caldwell, a man in his early 50s, salt and pepper hair slicked back, his tailored vest pressed to perfection, moved with purpose. Not rushed. Not frantic. But deliberate, as if he had just been informed of something critical. He made a beeline through the restaurant, past the glimmering chandelier and the meticulously arranged centerpieces. The clinking of forks stopped. Conversation stalled. All eyes followed him, most unaware of what was coming except for one person. Brooke. She spotted him the moment he turned the corner. Her heart dropped. Martin never left the back during dinner service. He only emerged for VIPs. Or disasters. Leonard, who had just placed his fork down, turned his head slightly as Martin approached. No surprise in his face. No tension. Just quiet anticipation. "Mr. Miles," Martin said warmly, dipping his head. "We're honored to have you with us tonight." Gasps. Audible gasps. The name Miles landed like thunder. Brooke, standing frozen near the espresso machine, felt her hands tremble. Her eyes widened in disbelief. No. No, it couldn't be. Martin continued, "I wasn't aware you'd be dining with us this evening. If I had known, we would have prepared your usual table." Leonard offered a courteous smile. "No worries, Martin. I was just passing through and thought I'd stop by, quietly." "Of course," Martin said, his voice slightly strained, glancing briefly around the restaurant. He noticed the whispers, the stares, the discomfort. He noticed Brooke. The entire restaurant had turned silent, save for the subtle hum of the jazz track continuing overhead. It wasn't just that Leonard Miles was known. It was who he was. Not only a former professional athlete turned real estate mogul, but also a silent investor and co-founder of the Iron Oak itself. The restaurant was partly his. Brooke's knees buckled slightly, and she placed a hand on the counter behind her for balance. Leonard glanced up toward her. Their eyes met. His gaze wasn't cruel. But it was unflinching. She had tried to reduce him to a stereotype. A disruption. A nobody in worn sneakers. But he was the reason this restaurant existed. Back at table 6, Vanessa leaned over and whispered, "She just insulted one of the owners." Her friend covered her mouth. "Oh my God." Even Mr. Langston, ever the stoic, muttered, "Justice." Swift and silent. Martin cleared his throat, bowing slightly. "If there's anything we can do to make up for the delay." Leonard raised a hand gently, silencing him with grace. "No need. I've been treated exactly how you train your staff to treat anyone who doesn't come in wearing Armani." That sentence cracked through the room like a lightning bolt. Martin's jaw stiffened. "We'll talk to the team immediately." Leonard nodded. "After dinner, if you don't mind. I'd like to speak to the staff personally." Martin bowed. "Of course." As he stepped away, Leonard took another sip of water, his every move now amplified by the room's stunned silence. Brooke? She was still frozen. Still clutching the marble counter. Her cheeks flushed crimson, her confidence shattered. She had tried to test a stranger's worth with snide remarks and silent judgment. And she'd failed the test he had quietly given her. She had failed in front of the very man who paid her salary. Behind her, Jake whispered to another waiter, "She's done." "That's it." At the corner table, Mrs. Langston leaned toward her husband. He could have yelled. He could have demanded she be fired on the spot. Mr. Langston gave a proud nod. But he didn't. That's the difference between power and wisdom. Leonard slowly placed his napkin down beside the empty plate. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look smug. He looked focused. Because this wasn't revenge. This was restoration. And the most powerful man in the room had never raised his voice. As Martin stepped away to gather the staff, the tension in the Iron Oak didn't ease, it deepened. All eyes remained on Leonard Miles. Not because he demanded attention. But because of what he didn't do. He hadn't exploded. He hadn't exposed Brooke with fury. He had simply let truth sit at the table with him, and now, truth was taking over the room. Leonard slowly stood from his seat. His towering frame stretched above the table, and with it, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Even the soft jazz in the background faded into irrelevance. Glasses stilled mid-air. Forks hung motionless over plates. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clear his throat. He simply began to speak. "This place," Leonard said, glancing around, "was built with a vision." He turned slowly, making sure to meet the eyes of those watching, not with anger, but with clarity. A vision that said anyone who walked through those doors, no matter what they wore, what they drove, or how they looked, should feel welcome. The words landed like a soft hammer, knocking on the conscience of every guest in the room. "I believed," he continued, "that respect shouldn't be reserved for the well-dressed, or the wealthy. It should be the minimum standard for every human interaction." He didn't look at Brooke. But she felt every word. She stood by the counter, eyes wide, unable to move. Her hands shook slightly at her sides, and her lips parted as if she wanted to say something but knew she couldn't. Leonard took a breath. Calm, controlled. "But tonight," he said, "we failed. And I say we because silence is complicity." A man in the corner lowered his gaze. A woman near the window closed her eyes, ashamed. A young server placed her tray down slowly, hands trembling. I sat there, Leonard gestured to his corner seat, and I waited. Not just for my food, but to see what you would do. His eyes swept the room. And now I know. Brooke's knees buckled. She gripped the back of a nearby chair to stay upright. Vanessa, still seated at her table, muttered under her breath, "This is the realest thing this restaurant has ever seen." Leonard took a step forward, hands relaxed, voice unwavering. "I'm not angry. I'm not here to shame. I'm here to remind." Another pause. Heavy. Reflective. You don't need to know someone's name to treat them with dignity. You don't need to recognize someone's face to recognize their humanity. Mr. Langston whispered to his wife, "That's leadership. That's legacy." A few diners nodded. One young woman wiped a tear discreetly. The air was thick not with tension now, but with reckoning. Leonard finally turned toward Brooke. Not with wrath, but with empathy. "You made assumptions tonight," he said, his voice softer now. "And they cost you something far more valuable than a tip." Brooke opened her mouth but no sound came. Leonard nodded slowly, kindly. "But that loss," he said gently, "doesn't have to be permanent if you're willing to learn from it." He turned back toward the rest of the restaurant. "Because the truth is, we all make mistakes. But it's what we do after the mistake that defines who we really are." Then, silence. Pure. Undeniable. Transformative. And then applause. It started small. A single clap from Mr. Langston. Then another from Vanessa. Then it spread. Like a rising wave. The entire restaurant, diners, servers, kitchen staff stood and applauded. Not because they were forced to, but because they knew they had just witnessed something rare. A man who chose grace over ego, truth over pride, and respect over revenge. And in that moment, the Iron Oak didn't feel like a restaurant. It felt like a classroom. And Leonard Miles had just taught the most important lesson anyone could learn. The night wore on. One by one, the last guests left the Iron Oak in solemn silence, some exchanging quiet glances of apology toward Leonard as they passed. Others placed hands over their hearts, as if to say thank you without words. The doors eventually shut behind the final patron, and the lights dimmed to a soft glow. The hum of the city outside faded into a quiet murmur. Inside, the staff gathered, some still in uniform, others too nervous to speak. They stood in a semicircle near the main floor, just beneath the massive iron oak sculpture that hung above the bar. The chandelier's light flickered against the polished wood and gold accents, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Leonard Miles stood at the center. Still composed. Still calm. Still kind. But this time, with the full weight of purpose in his gaze. Martin Caldwell, the manager, stood off to the side, his arms crossed, his jaw set. Jake lingered behind the bar, eyes wide with silent respect. And at the very edge of the group, standing apart from the others, her shoulders drawn tight and eyes fixed on the floor, Brooke. Leonard took a breath. "I want to thank you all," he began, his deep voice resonating through the silent room. "For staying tonight. I know it's been a long evening." A few nodded. Some looked at their shoes. "I didn't ask for anything special when I came in tonight," he said. "I wasn't testing anyone. I wasn't looking for drama. I was hungry. I wanted a meal. I wanted peace." He paused, but what I found instead was a mirror. That word lingered. "A mirror," he repeated, reflecting back everything I already knew about this world but hoped I wouldn't see in this place. His eyes swept across the staff, servers, hosts, kitchen runners. Not in judgment, but in challenge. "You see, it's easy to be kind to people who look like they have money. Who walk in wearing the right shoes, the right jacket. But real character? He paused. It's shown when you don't know who someone is. He didn't look at Brooke. But she flinched anyway. Leonard turned slightly. This restaurant was built with integrity. With the promise that we'd create something different. Not just elegant. Not just expensive. But human. Jake straightened a little, his chest rising. I'm not here to humiliate anyone, Leonard said. I'm here to ask, what kind of place do you want this to be? The silence was thick. Then, unexpectedly, Leonard turned to Brooke. Everyone else turned with him. Her breath caught in her chest. She couldn't hide behind trays now. Brooke, he said softly. She looked up, her eyes glassy, lips trembling. I want to hear from you, he continued. Not for me. For you. And for this team. The room tensed. No one moved. Brooke stepped forward slightly. Her voice cracked before it even emerged. Then finally, she swallowed. I was wrong. Completely. Her voice broke. I thought I was upholding the standard. But really, I was just protecting my own bias. I judged you because you didn't fit what I expected from someone who dined here. Tears slid down her cheek. I forgot that the job isn't to judge. It's to serve with dignity. And I failed. Leonard didn't respond immediately. He let the words settle. Let her own reckoning wash over the room. Then, he nodded slowly. You didn't fail because you made a mistake, he said. You failed because you let it go unchallenged. But now, you've faced it. And that's the beginning of change. Brooke looked down, ashamed. But this time, not destroyed. Martin stepped forward. We'll have follow-up meetings. Training. I take responsibility too. Leonard nodded. But then he turned to the team again. This place, the Iron Oak, can be better. It will be better. But only if we all decide that respect isn't a luxury item on the menu. He stepped back. It's the foundation. Silence again. But this time, a different kind. Not cold. Not ashamed. But hopeful. Brooke wiped her face and whispered, "Thank you." Leonard offered a small smile. "Thank me by doing better. Not just here. But everywhere." Martin looked around at the staff. "All right, everyone. That's it for tonight." But no one moved. They just stood there, each person reflecting on something deeper than service time or wine pairings. They had just been given something no training manual could ever offer. A second chance. The staff slowly drifted back into the kitchen and break room. No one rushed. No one joked. For the first time in a long while, the Iron Oak didn't buzz with the usual end-of-shift chatter. It was quiet. Not awkwardly so. But reverently. As if everyone understood something significant had just happened and it didn't need to be loud to be life-changing. Leonard Miles stood alone for a moment beneath the Iron Oak sculpture. The low light caught the edge of his profile, casting a soft golden shimmer on his skin. He ran his fingers along the wood grain of the table where he'd sat earlier, the one by the kitchen, tucked into the corner. The unwanted table. It was no longer just a table. It was where the truth had been revealed. Where the silence had shouted. Where change had begun. Martin Caldwell approached quietly, hands behind his back. "Leonard," he said softly, "I meant it will make things right." Leonard turned, offered a small smile. "I know you will. But it has to come from everyone. Not just the management." Martin nodded solemnly. "Understood." Without another word, Leonard headed toward the entrance. His sneakers scuffed, worn, and unapologetically plain padded against the marble as he walked. Jake watched him from behind the bar, eyes wide with respect. Brooke stood near the side hallway, hands clasped in front of her, watching his every step with quiet awe, not out of fear now, but with the humble gaze of someone who had finally seen. Leonard paused at the glass doors. The restaurant behind him had grown still. He turned. For one final time. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't raise a hand. He just said, "Kindness isn't a luxury. It's a choice. And every day you walk into this place, or any place, you get to decide what kind of world you're helping build." Then he nodded once to no one and everyone at once and stepped out into the night. The glass doors of the iron oak slowly closed behind him with a soft click. Outside, the streets of Dallas shimmered under the warm glow of street lamps. The air was still. The sidewalks empty. The hum of the city seemed to hush as Leonard walked, unhurried, toward his car parked a few blocks away. Each step echoed softly across the concrete. But those weren't just footsteps. They were footprints. Left behind in the minds of every person who had witnessed what happened that night. As he passed under the neon reflections of the nearby skyline, Leonard let out a quiet breath. Not one of exhaustion but of release. He had not come here tonight to change minds. But somehow, he had. Not through status. Not through force. But by refusing to shrink. By reminding others that humanity isn't something earned, it's something honored. He walked past a group of young men outside a cafe, their laughter dying down as they caught sight of him. One of them looked up and gave a nod. Leonard returned it. Simple. Equal. No assumptions. Just respect. And then he disappeared into the quiet of the city, the glow of the iron oak fading behind him. Inside that building, something had shifted permanently. No longer just a restaurant. But now a landmark not for cuisine, but for conscience. As Leonard Miles drove down the quiet, tree-lined avenues of Dallas, headlights casting soft shadows against the sidewalks, his mind wasn't on the road. It was on that table. That dim corner. That heavy silence. That simple meal that had become a storm. But not the kind of storm that destroys. The kind that washes away the dust so people can finally see themselves clearly. He didn't feel proud. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt called. Because tonight wasn't about him. It never had been. It was about the way people treat each other when they think no one's watching. The words we choose when we think they won't matter. The moments we dismiss because it's just a job, or just a stranger, or just a table. But nothing is ever just anything when a human soul is involved. Leonard remembered what his mother once told him when he was a boy being mocked for his size. "Son, the world will always try to measure you. By your shoes. By your words. By your skin. But never forget, you're not here to be measured. You're here to build something bigger than them all." And tonight, he had tried to do just that. Not by towering over them. But by not shrinking for them. As he pulled into his driveway and stepped out of the car, the night air wrapped around him like a gentle robe. The stars above shimmered, quiet witnesses to the choices made that evening. And in that silence, Leonard thought of the world we all walk into each day. We don't get to control it. We don't get to choose how others treat us. But we do get to choose what kind of brick we lay down with each interaction. Do we build a wall? Or a bridge? Do we enforce division? Or embody dignity? Do we walk past injustice because it doesn't affect us? Or do we pause and help someone stand? He looked up at the sky, then quietly to the door of his home, and whispered words that weren't just for himself. They were for us all. The world doesn't need louder voices. It needs kinder ones. The world doesn't need more gatekeepers. It needs door openers, and if every one of us, every server, every manager, every stranger chose, just once a day, to see with empathy instead of ego, then maybe, just maybe, we'd wake up in the kind of world we no longer need to fix. And with that final thought, Leonard stepped inside. Not a hero. Not a legend. Not a headline. Just a man who chose respect when it was hardest. And in doing so, he reminded the rest of us that we can too.